On Wednesday morning, I woke up feeling like I was living through the apocalypse. For a while, I indulged in those feelings of anger, horror, sadness, and shock. All the ingredients of self-pity soup. But the thoughts that surfaced weren't going to take me anywhere useful. In my Episcopalian childhood home, growing up, we had an 11th commandment, thou shalt not whine. So I started to think about what I could do that might help. A couple of summers ago, I attended a workshop offered at the monastery in Cottonwood. It was called Creative Peacemaking, and the instructor, Sister Elisa, had spent her career as a nun in LA in the gang territory, working with mothers whose children had been killed in those wars. It was intense. Over several sessions, Sister Elisa explained the painstaking process of building bridges. This is work that can best be done one-on-one and only through compassionate relationships, genuine relationships, in which we are vulnerable and open about our lives and our concerns. It takes a while, sometimes a long while, for others to feel safe being vulnerable with us. How do we develop those skills? Every week, Sister Elisa tells us, go to lunch with somebody you don't like. I didn't want to hear that. I can't seem to go to lunch even with people I like the most. But I have managed to check in with people of a different political persuasion wherever I find them, sort of a practice of opportunity. For me, it's most often the dog park. All these months later, I'm getting a little more comfortable with it. I feel less reactive, less threatened. Valuable as they are, these techniques are just a part of what will keep me grounded through the coming chaos. I have this work, even though I'm doing just a tiny part. I have books to read, including lots of escapist fiction. I have people to love, and people to love me back. I am a part of a community, this community. I don't know what's going to happen, but I know we will all keep building the world of our vision. I think that is what faith means.
This is a time of gathering and sharing inspiration and strength. Molly shared that she's feeling resourced and supported by the things she learned at the Creative Peacemaking workshop. And I'm sure many of you have been looking for and hopefully finding things that you can hold close as you rise from the fear and despair and start to move forward. And I hope you'll share them freely, not just on social media, but in actual conversations with actual three-dimensional humans. For me, Snyder, who we quoted earlier, is helpful strategically, but he's sort of hard on my heart. I don't think he's a pessimist exactly, but he's a realist, and he studies history's most heartbreaking episodes. Another resource I find insightful is perhaps a little more optimistic. It's an analysis offered by Daniel Harper and published by Waging Nonviolence. For those of you who are friends with me on Facebook, I shared the link a few days ago. The article is called 10 Ways to Be Prepared and Grounded Now That Trump Has Won. And it starts by pointing out that the key to taking effective action is to avoid perpetuating the autocrat's goals of fear, isolation, exhaustion, and disorientation. I'm going to read that again. The key to taking effective action is to avoid perpetuating the autocrat's goals of fear, isolation, exhaustion, and disorientation. Now, that doesn't mean we're not going to feel fear, isolation, exhaustion, and disorientation. We learned that 8 years ago. But we're not going to perpetuate them. We're not going to transmit them. When we feel them, we're going to feel them and then do what we need to turn back toward hope and justice and, most importantly, love. Okay? I need more than that. Okay? Okay. At the core of Harper's analysis is the concept of trust. He writes, Trump is arriving at a time of great social distrust. Across the board, society has reduced trust in traditional institutions. Yes, there's more distrust of the media, medical professionals, experts, and politicians, but it extends beyond that. There's reduced trust in most community institutions and membership groups. Whether from COVID or political polarization, a lot of us have experienced reduced trust in friends and family. Even our trust in predictable weather is diminished. Distrust fuels the flame of autocracy because it makes it much easier to divide. We can see that in the casual nature of Trump's rhetoric, telling people to distrust immigrants, Democrats, socialists, people from Chicago, women marchers, Mexicans, the press, and so on. This is a social disease. You know who to trust by who they tell you to distrust. It's the end of the reading. The first and most important person we need to trust is ourselves. We need to trust that still small voice inside. We need to trust our own deep knowing. We need to believe our inner voice when it tells us what the right next thing to do is, even if it seems kind of illogical. An example. The first time I felt despair after a presidential election was in 2004. My brother was serving in Iraq, and not only that, he was on communications blackout because he'd reported a superior officer for unethical behavior. The guy he reported actually fired a weapon at my brother, who was sitting in an armored vehicle and didn't get hurt. But still, I saw the Bush-Cheney ticket as evil. They were putting my beloved baby brother's life at risk for the sake of Halliburton's bottom line. And when they won re-election, it felt like the ground had collapsed out from under me. In that moment, you know what my still small voice said to me? Get a dog. Get a dog. I kid you not. Now, getting a dog made absolutely no sense. I was balancing 2 more than full-time jobs, caring for 2 rambunctious little boys, but you know what? We did it anyway. We got a dog because my spirit recognized something that my whirling brain and my broken heart couldn't. My whole family needed more joy and unconditional love in our lives. And nobody does unconditional love better than a dog. All these years later, thinking back on that time, I feel kind of naive. As my friend James put it when Cheney endorsed Harris, I'm suffering severe cognitive dissonance, feeling thankful and even affectionate toward Dick Cheney. I've even developed a soft spot for George W. Bush when I heard he was painting portraits of all the service members who had died during his time in office in that stupid, pointless war. He's holding himself accountable. And it turns out accepting responsibility for harm goes a long way toward earning forgiveness, at least my forgiveness. Now, Harper also names that we need to cultivate trust in others. We need to build resilient networks of relationships and a culture of mutual respect and support. He writes, Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism explored how destructive ideologies like fascism and autocracy grow. She used the word Verlassenheit, often translated as loneliness, as a central ingredient. She meant it. Loneliness isn't a feeling, but a kind of social isolation of the mind. Your thinking becomes closed off to the world and a sense of being abandoned to each other. She's identifying a societal breakdown that we're all experiencing, and under a Trump presidency, this trend will continue to accelerate. I know that since the election, every time I walk into a room, I'm scanning for clues. Is that person safe to be honest to? Or did they vote for the guy? Are they gathering evidence that I'm one of the enemies from within? My generally positive assessment of human nature took a hit on Tuesday, but I know this is not good for me, and it's also dangerous strategically. We need to have groups of people we trust to help ground and stabilize us. We need to have trusting relationships with other people who share our values and are standing by to help. We need to have trusting relationships with people who are likely targets so that they know they can come to us if they need help. As for the distrust I'm feeling of people I don't know, what purpose does that serve except to drive us further apart? It's essential that we continue to see one another as human beings despite our differences. Dehumanization is the prerequisite to violence. This becomes relevant as we consider the stories we're going to tell ourselves about how we got here. As I shared at the Vesper service on Wednesday, there's a story, and I think it's a true story, though it may not be completely true, and it's definitely not the only story that's true. And it goes like this: times are really hard. Between climate change and natural disasters, the economic shifts in our nation, and the focus on our legacy of racism, sexism, and other forms of oppression, there are a whole bunch of folks who feel overwhelmed and powerless and afraid and isolated. And when human beings feel that way, overwhelmed and powerless and afraid and isolated, it is a lot easier to blame someone else than it is to be present to those feelings and to accept our role in causing the problems in the first place. All humans do this. Blaming the other is a universal human coping strategy. So when folks gravitate toward leaders who blame immigrants and queer folks and liberals and the like, they are looking for relief from their existential pain. And I can't condone this behavior ever, but maybe I can try to understand it. I can feel compassion for people who are scared and alone and overwhelmed. Now, as I said, this may or may not be a true story, but it's a story that'll help keep me from falling into the same trap, from blaming and dehumanizing those folks on the other side of the political divide. For me, it's less about being what's true for them and more about what allows me to stay true to who I want to be true to my best self. Now, Harper goes on to encourage us to grieve when needed, release all that we can't change, and find our specific path. He groups the options into 4 general categories. We can protect people, defend civic institutions, disrupt and disobey, or start working on building alternatives. To his list, I'd add supporting and helping to heal those who have been hurt. Within these broad categories, there are as many roles to play as there are people who are getting ready to play them. We don't have to know right now how we're going to fight for goodness and justice, peace and love. We just have to commit to knowing when we know, we will act. We have to get ourselves ready for when it is time. Harper offers some other specific pieces of advice to do that. Again, I'd recommend you look it up for yourself when you are ready. Because right now, I think many of us are still reeling, and we don't know what's going to happen. Timothy Snyder says not to comply in advance. I would add, I don't think we should catastrophize in advance, because it's a waste of our precious life energy. We're going to need every ounce of that energy to get through what's coming. And we're going to need one another to remind each and every one of us that we are loved and worthy just as we are, to keep the isolation and helplessness at bay, to help one another be brave in the face of danger, to provide practical support, to people who need us, to not just survive, but to keep building the world we are dreaming of, based on the values that are hanging on these walls. We can do it even in a hostile environment. We're going to get through this. Rebecca Solnit reminds us, the fact that we cannot save everything does not mean we cannot save anything. And everything we can save is worth saving. For my part, I'm going to try not to let the political mess our country finds itself in change who I am or how I want to be in the world. I will act to protect the vulnerable, and I will resist not just hate, but complacency and the urge to dehumanize. I pledge to be joyful because joy is resistance. I pledge to be gentle with myself because rest is resistance too. Above all, I pledge to live and lead with fierce, fierce love. Are you with me? So be it, and so may it be.